Fred. Welcome to our talk with Fred Rosenbaum. Before I introduce Fred, a little bit of housekeeping. The film festival, the 30th year, is going to take place the last week in February at the Century 16 in Pleasant Hill. And then in March, I believe it'll start the second week and go into the third week. We're going to show a virtual festival. You'll get more information in December about the film festival. We hope that you'll join as a donor or at least buy a pass. Then in December, on December 12th, the second Thursday of the month, Fred will be back with a very interesting topic about baseball and the Jews. We can't show a movie ourselves, but you can go to Amazon and see the movie Baseball and the Jews, a love story. I think it is a little bit less than $4, so it's very affordable. We hope that you will see it and then listen to Fred on December 12th at 7 p.m. A little bit different story than he normally does, and I think it'll be very refreshing to learn about that subject, about baseball and the Jewish community in the 30s through the 1960s. And now I'll introduce Fred Rosenbaum. I'm sure everyone who has signed on knows who he is. Fred is an American author, a historian, and adult educator. He founded and directed one of the great Jewish education centers in Northern California, Lehr House Judaica. Today, Lehr House continues as New Lehr House, and Fred is no longer the director, but he, I think, still gives courses when requested, and it's a really great program which you can go to. Rosenbaum grew up in Queens and earned his bachelor's degree at Washington University in St. Louis. Subsequently, he studied the history of Nazi Germany as a Fulbright scholar in West Germany, and he earned a master's degree in European history at the University of California in Berkeley. An award-winning author, he has written numerous books, including Cosmopolitan, which is a story of the cultural history of the Jews of the San Francisco Bay Area, and has co-authored several memoirs about Jewish partisans. Fred has also been a traveling scholar and has done for 25 study tours, I think it is 25, throughout the world. And next September, we'll do one in a very lovely part of the world, Alsace, France, and the Rhine Valley. And you'll learn more about that in December when we can give you information about how to sign up, which I suggest you do very quickly because it doesn't take 100 people. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce Fred Rosenbaum, who will answer questions at the end of his presentation.
Hey, thank you, Riva, for arranging this, giving me this opportunity. And thank you, Gabor, for all of your help on the tech side. Now, Roman Vishniac was the greatest photographer of Jewish life in the 20th century, both in terms of his art and his lasting influence. All the more remarkable because he was not a photographer by profession. He identified himself as a scientist and accomplished a great deal in microbiology, so a multi-sided genius. His life story reminds me of the character of Zelig in the Woody Allen film of that name. It's uncanny how he turns up at the most pivotal points in history and adapts himself to each new environment. As a privileged Jew at university in Tsarist Russia, then caught up in the Russian Revolution, a striving immigrant in avant-garde Weimar Republic, a persecuted artist in Nazi Germany, a superb photographer in pre-war Eastern Europe, a fugitive and prisoner in France, a newcomer in America, where Zelig-like, He walks into Albert Einstein's office at Princeton and photographs him at his desk and his chalkboard. And last but not least, as a pioneer in the burgeoning field of photomicroscopy. He was world renowned, a lavishly talented, ever resilient dynamo. But I also wanted to discuss this documentary for its local connection. In 2018, the entire Vishniac archive, 30,000 items, was gifted to the Magnus Collection, now part of UC Berkeley. The family had several ties to the Bay Area, but surely much of the credit for this acquisition, one of the most valuable donations of art in the history of the university, credit goes to the Magnus staff, whom Vishniac's descendants felt could best preserve and display the images. I was invited to lunch with the Magnus faculty director at the time, Professor Emeritus George Breslauer, formerly university provost, who was naturally elated with the gift, but said he still lacked the resources and needed to organize and catalog the vast archive. Well, he soon received an anonymous $1 million grant just for that purpose. 4 years later, the Magnus, reopening after the pandemic, triumphantly showcased its prize with a comprehensive exhibit, including Vishniac's lesser-known photos of Berlin and Jerusalem. This film, with daughter Mara as the narrator of her own story as well as her father's, was released earlier this year. Another step in what I would call the Vishniac revival. I appreciate the film's honesty. You know, biographical documentaries, especially when the subject's family is involved to this extent, are often hagiographical, sweeping under the rug anything compromising, particularly about the individual's personal life. But here we learn much about Vishniac's disastrous first marriage and his troubled relationship with his son and his daughter. His many character flaws are freely discussed. First, his colossal ego. And I love Mara's line that he thought himself a cross between Moses and Superman. Several family members refer to his tendency not only to exaggerate, but also make stuff up out of whole cloth. He claimed to have multiple PhDs and an MD when he had no degrees at all. He said that he wore the uniform of a Nazi stormtrooper to take pictures of synagogues burning during Kristallnacht, but there is no evidence of that. He maintained without any proof that in Poland he was arrested and imprisoned 11 times. These are just a few of the countless fabrications throughout his life. Yet they do not detract from the sheer brilliance of his photos, especially those of East European Jewry on the eve of the war. Let's look at the first slide. His technique was masterful. Dramatic compositions. Notice the high contrast lighting, the juxtaposition of light and shadow, close-ups of faces, lending intimacy. In some of Vishniac's images, the lighting almost seems to come from within. In this respect, Elie Wiesel compared several of the photos to Rembrandt paintings. Now let's scroll down. This is documentary photography that, more than a commissioned portrait, say, tells a story, usually about social injustice. And his work ranks alongside the great visual chroniclers of this era, Dorothea Lange, Walker Evans, and Robert Capa. There you see two from Dorothea Lange. And you can see just the intensity of these photographs put together. The one on the left, of course, is one of the most famous photographs in American history, Migrant Mother. These were all taken in the late 1930s. And I think there's especially strong similarity with Lange, who of course showed the deprivation of the Depression. Okay, let's scroll down to the next one. Vishniac was also influenced by the modernism that permeated much of Weimar culture. In Berlin, which was the epicenter of experimental art, he was an adherent of what was called New Vision photography. In the innovative style of the design known as the Bauhaus, in order to capture everyday life, the camera focused not only on people, but also on the structural lines of architecture, which you see here. Let's look at the next one. Here you see how that affected his photography in Eastern Europe. It's not just the people. He's also interested in the buildings, in the streets. Look at especially the one on the right. The composition is really something exceptional, where you get a feel like you're walking right there in that alley. And then the one on the left, he was just fascinated with the way these houses would look next to one another. So angular. Okay, you can remove that slide, and let's go to the next one, image number 2. Thank you. Vishniac asserted that nearly all his subjects were photographed without their knowledge, through spontaneous snap shooting. This is known as candid photography. He said that otherwise religious Jews would not let him take their picture out of modesty or trying to avoid making graven images. He insisted that he kept his Rolleiflex camera that you see here, he used for outdoor shots. He said that he kept it under his coat with just the lens poking out of an enlarged buttonhole. And for interiors, he said he hid his smaller Leica camera in his handkerchief and then made a motion as if to mop his brow while he pressed the shutter button. It sounds implausible that he could have done that. And experts concluded that the large majority of his subjects were aware that they were being photographed. And some stopped and posed for Vishniac in shots that were staged. Show the next one, please. You can see people looking at him. And I found out that this was confirmed when researchers greatly magnified the photos, and they could see Vishniac reflected in the eyes of the subjects holding his camera in full view. Now, I wanted to show you this for another reason. The one on the right is a 7-year-old boy. And he survived 5 camps, including Auschwitz. He survived. He came out of the fire alive. His entire family was wiped out, except for one sibling. He came to the United States in the 1950s and settled in Woodstock, New York, and became a Buddhist. He's still alive. Okay, you can remove that, please. See, here he is on the cover of the first book, Polish Jews, a Pictorial Record. This one came out in 1947. Now, in the interwar period, 50,000 East European Jews streamed into Berlin and lived in a congested, dilapidated district known as the Barn Quarter, where horses had been stabled. Most German Jews tended to look down on the poor, bedraggled, Yiddish-speaking immigrants in their midst, look down on them as alien intruders. One might have expected this revulsion to be shared by the sophisticated Vishniac, who resided in upscale Berlin and lived in one of the finest neighborhoods there for 20 years. Yet his photos, while certainly depicting hardship, also convey dignity and sanctity. Or simultaneous with the denigration of the Ostjuden, as they were called, a cultural trend in Germany at this time valorized them for their closeness to God, absorption in rabbinic texts, time-honored folkways. For some, this was a favorable contrast to the increasing assimilation of Weimar Jewry, which felt crass and hollow. In short, there was a tendency to portray East European Jews as poor in material things, but exalted spiritually. Let's look at the next slide, please. This is an example of the work of very well-known artists in the first decades of the 20th century, Hermann Struck. And these are etchings. And he was a World War I veteran. Like a number of German Jewish intellectuals in World War I, stationed on the Eastern Front in Russia, they came in contact with these Orthodox Jewish communities. And you can see these are done almost in a loving way. And idealizing these Ostjuden was not uncommon in the 1920s and 30s. And Vishniac was no doubt affected by this. You can see this kind of a vision is a forerunner, really, of many of his photographs. Okay, you can remove that now. Thank you. Vishniac always claimed that he journeyed east on a mission, a sacred mission, that he had intuited the Holocaust and wanted to preserve Jewish life visually before it was liquidated. Of course, that is not true. No one grasped this in 1935, not even German Jews under Nazi rule. Some could foresee a war, but not the Shoah. As I've mentioned in several other talks, the death camps, the killing factories, were unprecedented in human history. As one historian has said, European Jewry could anticipate the worst, but not the unthinkable. Most scholars believe that the Nazis themselves did not plan the final solution until their invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. Vishniac was not clairvoyant, and in reality, his journey was less a personal mission than a paid commission by the JDC, the American Joint Distribution Committee, usually just called the Joint, a major relief organization which in the 1930s was raising funds to aid destitute East European Jews. Now, of course, helping the Joint by taking these pictures, that was a noble goal in itself. Yet after the war, Vishniac concocted this much higher purpose of his trips. In fact, rather than trying to portray beleaguered Polish Jewry as a whole, he went looking for the most impoverished among them, often children, who would evoke the sympathy, pity really, of the viewer, who hopefully would donate to the cause. Let's look at the next slide. Now, to increase the pathos, he made up captions and descriptions such as this one for one of his most famous pictures taken in Warsaw in 1938. He says, the little girl had to stay in her bed for 7 months because she had no shoes. Her father painted flowers for her, the only flowers of her youth. In photos found later, the same girl is seen outside wearing shoes. He never mentioned the JDC, which paid him handsomely, even during the Depression. Okay, you can remove that one. Thank you. They paid him $15,000 over 3 years. That's equal to about $250,000 today. Of course, the Joint had to be very frugal in this time of overwhelming need, but they considered him central to their fundraising efforts and thus worth his high fee. His striking images helped their annual campaign for Eastern Europe rise from $100,000 in 1930 to over $1 million by 1939. Now, let's look at the next one. I actually, if you could scroll down from the one that was before, that's the one I want to show. Yeah, that's right. Just scroll down from that. There you go. His photos were imprinted on their letterhead, and they were made into slideshows at parlor meetings and exhibited in the JDC main office. The Joint also put the image of this girl on the tin tzedakah, or charity boxes. Okay, let's look at the next slide, please. Vishniac's many pre-war expeditions covered a vast amount of territory, even the remote Carpathian Mountains. And thank you for showing it right there. Now, at that time, it was part of Czechoslovakia, but we think of Czechoslovakia as a fairly somewhat prosperous country. But this was not part of the true Czechoslovakia. It was added on after World War I. It had really been a part of Hungary before that. And it's in the remote Carpathian Mountains, home to the poorest and most isolated Jewish community in Europe, known even among the other Ostjuden as the land of the schnorrers. That is Yiddish for the beggars. Again, it's not surprising that he went there because his whole purpose was to show the most impoverished Jews that he could. He also went to the great cities of Warsaw, Krakow, Vilna, and Lodz. Now, note Vilna, that's actually in Poland in the interwar period. We think of that as Lithuania, but it was in Poland. If you look at this map, you can see the large territory of Poland, how big it was, how important it was in Central Europe as a whole. Okay, we can remove that now. Thank you. But if Vishniac traveled widely, his photos went on a journey also, in the sense that over 85 years, their purpose and meaning changed again and again. And this is a testament to the power of his art, that it remained compelling in so many different contexts. In the early 1940s, as the Holocaust unfolded, the Joint used the photos in a new way to generate sympathy and raise money for the victims of Nazism. The images of persecution and want in pre-war Poland now morphed into a picture of German-occupied Poland. And this was the impression given in the exhibits and the press in New York during the war. Let's look at the next slide. Now, the film shows these photos of a boy signaling his father that the Gestapo is coming. And this was published in newspapers in 1941. That's why I put the date 1941 there. But of course, they were not taken then. Vishniac wasn't there in 1941, and the Gestapo was not there when Vishniac was there. These photos were taken in Poland in 1938, and they're from two different cities. One taken in Warsaw, one taken in Lodz. The images were placed facing each other to make it look like the boy is alerting his father. I doubt that it's very unlikely that these two even knew each other. Now, I really want to stress that I'm not making a moral judgment about such manipulation, because the goal here was to sensitize the American public to the slaughter of Polish Jewry. And if doctoring the pictures helped, so be it. Rather, my point is that Vishniac's work years earlier could now be presented as breaking news. Okay, can remove that now. After the Shoah, the pictures soon took on yet another meaning, a memorial to the 6 million. When they were taken, neither the subjects nor the photographer anticipated the final solution. I've mentioned that. But after 1945, no one viewing and absorbing these intimate images can put aside the chilling fact that almost all the people shown would be murdered in the next few years. So while in real time, the photos were made to show urgent need, and a few years later used to represent Nazi barbarism, they now depict something else again: impending doom. To look at them is almost an act of mourning. They are surrounded by a kind of religious aura, like connecting with martyred ancestors. At the U.S. Holocaust Museum in D.C., there is a permanent gallery devoted entirely to Vishniac's photos. Many visitors approach them almost as votive relics. And the same room holds a sacred object, a Torah scroll saved from a synagogue destroyed by the Nazis. Now, in the post-war decades, the images have served still another purpose. They have become emblematic of pre-war Polish Jewry. They have shaped our memory of pre-war Polish Jewry. Beginning with his album of 1947 that I showed you before, Vishniac gave people the impression that essentially all there was to Polish Jews consisted of poverty, persecution, and piety. And indeed, he entitles it Polish Jews, but the subtitle is A Pictorial Record. And this portrayal was boosted further by the immensely successful Broadway musical Fiddler on the Roof, which premiered in 1964. The play was partially based on Vishniac's photos. Many in the cast knew little about the world of Tevye the milkman. So the director, Jerome Robbins, gave each actor a copy of the book, Polish Jews, to acquaint them with the milieu of the shtetl. The impact of Fiddler further deepened when it was made into a blockbuster movie, which won the Oscar for Best Picture. Later, as the film describes, Steven Spielberg used the photos in setting scenes of Schindler's List. Vishniac's images also illustrated the covers of several books on East European Jewish culture and even inspired poetry. But did his work, and he printed only 350 negatives out of 2,000 that he brought back from Eastern Europe, did his work accurately convey Jewish life there? Now, of course, there were hundreds of these ultra-Orthodox communities. But by the late 1930s in Poland, they constituted a minority of Jews. In fact, the enormous Jewish community of 3.3 million, the largest in Europe, was remarkably diverse in its politics, its religiosity, its standard of living, its level of acculturation. If I had to identify one main trend, it would be that Polish Jewry was rapidly breaking from tradition and secularizing and modernizing. Typical was the late Joseph Pell, who, as Yossel Applebaum, grew up in a shtetl before the war, and whose memoir I co-authored. He told me that although his father was a respected shochet, a kosher slaughterer, and learned in Talmud, each of his 5 children completely rejected Jewish observance. Joe and his friends ate pork sausages on Yom Kippur. But they made one concession. They ate this treif in the basement because they thought if God did exist, he wouldn't be able to see them. Now, I must correct the statement in the film that Jews took jobs that Poles would not accept because they were too hard or unpleasant. In reality, the percentage of Jewish menial laborers was lower than that of Polish workers. And Jews fared far better than the Poles professionally. In the 1930s, they were more than half of the physicians in the country. and 1/3 of the lawyers. They were leading industrialists, artists, even prominent politicians who sat in the parliament. Yes, the government and public were anti-Semitic, but this Jewish community fought for its rights. It had agency. It was not as passive as Vishniac's subjects. Still, roughly 90% of Polish Jewry, 3 million people, were killed in the Shoah. But they were of various backgrounds, and like the ultra-Orthodox, their world vanished too. Now, most of you know I live in Brooklyn now. I often see throngs of Hasidic men in the streets and parks, sometimes singing, even dancing. Now, let's say someone took vivid photos of those Haredim, as they're known. And if, God forbid, there was a terrible hurricane and all New York was swept into the sea, years later, an album of those photos of Hasidim came out with the title New York Jews. It would be incomplete, to say the least. That Vishniac helped create a skewed image of Polish Jewry is surprisingly missed in this otherwise excellent documentary. There was not, as Vishniac says in the film, unbroken oppression in Poland, but rather centuries of relative toleration, especially during the late Middle Ages, which saw a huge influx of Jews from England, France, and German-speaking lands. That's where they were treated with the utmost brutality and ultimately expelled. In Hebrew, the word Poland is Polin, and many historians believe the meaning is rest here, Polin, a safe haven. Sometimes called a golden age, Jewish migrants in Poland were granted religious freedom, almost complete autonomy. Many aristocrats hired them to manage their estates, which included mills and wineries, farmlands, and forests. But the country of Poland ceased to exist in the late 1700s, much of it annexed by Tsarist Russia, which severely persecuted Jews. Poland was reconstituted after World War I, and the Jewish community, 10% of the population, was a target of the dogmatic Catholic Church, and it was a scapegoat for nativist politicians, but largely protected by the strongman Marshal Józef Pilsudski. After his death in 1935, the Jews were more vulnerable. There were punitive legislative decrees and outbreaks of violence, some of them deadly. Yet Jewish life relied on its own resources. It continued to thrive as nowhere else in the world. Yes, it was the most vibrant Jewish community in the world. Now, the film shows how Vishniac captured German Jewry's vibrancy and resourcefulness, even when it was subjugated. But in his photos, of Polish Jews, we see only resignation. This could have characterized the community 100 years earlier, under the Tsar, just turning to God for deliverance. But by the 1920s and 30s, there were several other very powerful responses to the Jewish plight. The assimilationists, perhaps 15% of the Jewish population, they spoke Polish, not Yiddish, as their main language. And they were proud of being Poles as well as Jews. some of them reach the highest rungs of society. Let's look at the next slide. In this synagogue, in the heart of Warsaw, the rabbi's sermons were delivered in Polish. The architecture and the decorum in the services were influenced by Christian churches. Let's scroll down to the next. A much larger group than the assimilationists, again having little in common with Vishniac's Polish Jews, were the Marxists, especially the Bundists, which you see in the top two photos. They were decidedly secular and socialist and advocated autonomy for the Jews in Poland. Almost 40% of the Jews in Warsaw voted for the Bund, for the Bund's political party in the legislative elections. And a majority did in Lodz and Vilna. Another group was the Zionists in all their varieties. The two largest were the revisionists led by the fiery orator Jabotinsky and the arch rivals, the labor Zionists led by Ben-Gurion. You know, the Yishuv, the Jewish settlement in mandatory Palestine, that consisted mostly of Polish Jews who made Aliyah in the 20s and 30s. The Zionists set up dozens of training camps in Poland to prepare young people for that purpose. Some Jews in pre-war Poland were communists, others were socialists who joined not the left-wing Bund or the labor Zionists, but the Polish Socialist Party. In short, we have a dazzling, almost dizzying variety of what it meant to be Jewish. There were over a dozen Yiddish newspapers in Warsaw. With 500,000, Warsaw was the largest Jewish community in the world, except for New York. When a Jewish stranger got off a train in a Polish town, he was often set upon by members of these rival groups, each trying to recruit him for their cause. And these various Jewish movements, they were more than just ideological or politically active. Each ran its own school system, vocational services, and supported active and often combative youth groups. Now, the participation of women, and you see an example of this in the photo toward the bottom of this page. The participation of women was high in all of these organizations that I'm speaking about, outside the ultra-Orthodox community. In contrast to Vishniac's photos, which show women only in traditional roles and largely marginalized. Much of the culture of the Polish Jews was cosmopolitan and eclectic, especially Yiddish theater. Plays ranged from Shakespearean classics like King Lear, although maybe that lost something in Yiddish translation, to a drama on the Scottsboro Boys, the 9 teenage blacks falsely accused of rape in Alabama. Let's look at the next slide. This is the famed Vilna troupe, presenting Eugene O'Neill's Desire Under the Elms, set in New England before the Civil War. This shows their willingness to incorporate the classics of other cultures into their repertoire. And that was a main characteristic of Polish Jewish culture before the war. Hollywood movies, subtitled in Yiddish, were beloved, including Gone with the Wind, The Wizard of Oz, King Kong in Yiddish. Polish Jews also loved American jazz and the dances that went with it. The lyrics of a popular Yiddish song told of a young woman threatening to dump her boyfriend if he didn't learn to dance the Charleston. Let's scroll down to the next one. Sports were a big part of Jewish life too. Skiing, cycling, soccer, boxing. In 1934, a Jew was one of the stars of the Polish national boxing team. Another represented Poland in the 1936 Olympics. Okay, we can remove that now. Thank you. The Yiddish literature of the time was extraordinary, but the greatest 20th century poet in the Polish language was also Jewish, Julian Tuwim. He received the highest award in the Polish Academy of Literature in 1935, just when Vishniac began his photographic journey. Now, let's pause for a second and ask, if Polish Jewish life was so very vigorous and broad-minded, as I've been showing, why did Vishniac's portrayal of a devout, cloistered, needy community, why did that take hold in the mind of American Jews and resonate even to this day? Now, certainly, there's the element of nostalgia, an emotional affection for the past lives of our forebears. We can thus link Vishniac's photos to the surge of interest in genealogy, travel to historic sites and synagogues, even the popularity of traditional Jewish food. A Reformed Jewish family might have in its home a picture of dancing Hasidim. By the way, few Hasidic homes have pictures of dancing Reformed Jews. Now, nostalgia has recently become a serious academic subject, one of the latest trends in Jewish studies. Some sociologists even calling nostalgia a new American Jewish religion. This controversial opinion holds that with synagogue attendance declining, nostalgia has become a substitute for worship, ritual, and Torah and Talmud study. Some deny this is happening, others admit the shift, but lament it. But let me go beyond nostalgia to understand the allure of Vishniac's images. First of all, he alone among the other leading Jewish photographers of Eastern Europe, he alone survived to tell the story. No one else on his level remained to present a visual refutation that would be as powerful. Also, his message is clear and cogent. These gentle, innocent, prayerful people were soon wiped out. And of course, that is the truth. And this perspective, you stick just with this, you spare yourself having to think about the actual complexity of Polish Jewry, including communists, for example, or assimilationists, or the Bundists who naively put their faith in the Polish people. It ignores the deep rifts among the various Jewish groups and the key question of how well they were served by their leaders. In short, his portrayal is easy to grasp, maybe too easy. Now, Vishniac's poignant photos have also given American Jews a sense of satisfaction. They prove how far we've come in just 2 or 3 generations. They depict a near medieval way of life in stark contrast to our own prosperous, highly acculturated, ultra-modern existence. We live in a different universe than the people in those photos. We can feel astonishingly lucky. But while we're glad to leave behind the desperate poverty and insularity, we also sense in these photos admirable qualities of fervent spirituality and learning and community and continuity, attributes often lacking in American Jewry that we wish we had. So that too makes these images appealing. However, this is admiration for a partly mythologized past. Of course, many found the deepest joy and meaning in this pious life. But we also know that women especially often felt constricted and hardly content. The memoir literature tells us that those who strayed from the prescribed path, sometimes shunned, even by their own family members. Rabbinical responsa of the time revealed cases of domestic abuse, extortion, swindling. These ultra-religious communities, criminality was not markedly less than in Poland as a whole. Now, let me conclude with the growing cultural and academic tide in recent decades to amend or at least supplement Vishniac's presentation. Again, we have a local connection in the person of Tad Toby, a philanthropist based on the peninsula who was born in pre-war Krakow to an assimilationist family. Let's look at the next slide. Toby is one of the 3 major donors responsible for the creation of the stellar Jewish Museum in Warsaw, named Polin to reflect the centuries of relative tolerance that I discussed earlier. Opened in 2014, it sits on the grounds of the former Warsaw Ghetto, has in its permanent exhibition 1 gallery devoted to the Holocaust. But the other 7 galleries display the full variety and vigor of 1,000 years of Polish Jewry and its interactions with the Gentile society, beneficial as well as harmful. Now let's scroll down. The centerpiece of the museum is a wooden 17th century Polish shul that was destroyed by the Nazis, but meticulously reconstructed by artisans using the same timber and tools and paints as the original. What do we see? Certainly something quite different from the drab synagogue's Vishniac photograph. And this particular one was very close to where he took many of his pictures. Okay, we can remove that. In the end, Vishniac's images, while brilliant, are sentiment as well as testament. They illuminate, yet also limit our interpretation of pre-war Jewish life. You can say that since Vishniac's photos, the goal of Jewish scholarship on Poland has been to fill in the rest of the picture. Thank you very much.
Fred, it was an excellent, excellent talk. Thank you so much. We're now open for questions. You can go to the chat button at the bottom of your screen, and after you think about it, ask any question to Fred. You covered so much. I was very, very impressed. Not only the history of the Holocaust, but also Polish history in general, and it was excellent.
Yeah, thank you. I have an email up there. If something occurs to you at any point in terms of what I said or Vishniac's photos, feel free to email me. I will get back to you, and I really would love this conversation to continue. So let's see if there are any questions. I'm delighted to take them now.
Yes, no? Well, I think you've given it, very.
I had a question. I just put it in the chat. Fantastic presentation, Fred, as always. So much depth. I really appreciate it. Did you mention when your trip is going to be? I didn't hear that.
Thank you for asking about the trip.
Yeah.
So that's going to be to Alsace, France, in the Rhine Valley, a very scenic area. So it's going to be September 8th to 18th next year.
Of next year. And is that through Tioul? Is that with Ariel?
Yeah, through Tioul.
It is.
Yeah, through Ariel. He's going to announce it in a couple of weeks. He will put it on his website and announce it.
Great.
So I hope you'll travel with us.
Well, it really, really sounds interesting. And I have not traveled with you or with his group, but I would like to. So look into that. Thanks.
Sure.
Great presentation. Thank you.
And Fred, if you can give me the information, I could put it on the website when it.
Great. Yeah, I appreciate that. And that's, really the birth of Ashkenazi Jewry is there.
Susan?
In that area. Yeah.
Susan, question?
Thank you. So thank you.